Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. I am with Allan Alexander, a member of my Symmetry Solutions team, and we are here to fight shame by sharing education, stories, whatever the heck we can, because shame has got to go.
Yes, it does.
We are going to talk about two topics today. It's going to be a fairly Latter-day Saint / Mormon day today. I know sometimes we cover other things and kind of religious news, and I think the main thing that's happening in our world today with with kind of somewhat religious / political conflict is the horrific things that are happening over in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. We are not necessarily going to cover that at all, other than to share, just the deep sadness and concern that we have as so many people in the world are watching this, this issue take place, I guess, this horrific time. And of course, both of us, Allan, have been around long enough to know that this has been, an ongoing conflict that has a long history. It's very complicated, it's very complex, and we just want to share our condolences to anyone who is suffering. I know that even within the Jewish communities and the Palestine communities, even here in the United States, there's conflict, as to opinions and considerations and thoughts. And boy, do we know a lot about in-group fighting, and othering even within in-groups. And it's just so hard. It's just so difficult. So our heartfelt condolences to all people who are suffering, especially children and innocent lives, on both sides of that equation. So to the topics that we are going to talk about, it's October 27th today. And that means that we had our General Conference in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at the very beginning of this month. As usual, there's a lot of messages given during that weekend that are uplifting and, and kind of center on the love of, the gospel of Jesus Christ and, concepts of mercy and grace and those kinds of things. And of course, there are also messages that are maybe more harsh or more direct in regards to adherence to certain standards or beliefs that the church, has definitely, at least some church leaders have definitely put a lot of stake in here recently. So we're going to talk about some of that and some of the ramifications that we've seen in our practice since General Conference, which we always do. We always see that kind of upkick of concerns and feelings and family conflict and marital conflict in regards to messages that are shared during General Conference, and even individual conflict, just kind of some struggles and feeling, how can I feel comfortable with some of these things, maybe not some of these other things. And so that creates this cognitive dissonance that so many people feel as they are, managing their relationship with their faith community, which is very common. We're here to talk about it. So I think I'm going to start off with a few positive messages. I know that Jana Spangler, who's a member of our team, she shared that she felt like two talks that were fairly positive from her perspective. So I just want to give her credit. Was one by Elder Arden, and it was called Love Thy Neighbor. And he just kind of talks a lot about, are we offering charity? Are we offering love? Are we, looking for opportunities to serve other people? And so, I think that any talk on charity and, how we conduct ourselves in the world in regards to seeing other people's either dilemmas or trials or tribulations, however you want to call that, and having compassion. I think the word compassion came up a lot in his talk. So I think that's wonderful. I think a call to compassion from any religious leader is really, I think, the messages we need to hear in the world today, for sure. We do live in kind of like a politically turbulent time. We live in a time where there's a lot of different ideas about healthcare and politics, and we have a lot of wealth in the world, but we also have a lot of poverty in the world. So how do we make that more, balanced? So yeah, I don't know, any thoughts that you have, Alan, around compassion and leaders who speak about compassion, and even this idea of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, providing for the widow type of scripture, right?
Well, that sounds a lot like the gospel of Jesus himself when he was here. He was, he look at the people that he associated with and that he tried to uplift. He was very much concerned with the downtrodden and the hurting and the suffering. So I think if you want to behave in a Christ-like way, that's an awesome thing to do because it is very Christ-like. And so that's it, and it's walking the walk instead of talking the talk. And it's acts. There's especially around issues with like gun violence or war or political unrest or anything else that's going on. People always say thoughts and prayers, thoughts and prayers. Well, it's like, yeah, but it's thoughts and prayers and deeds. So putting faith into action into a compassionate way is a great way to try and bridge some of the gaps, heal some of the wounds, conquer some of the divide, bring parties closer together, even amongst your own family, that we've seen over the last few years, and especially with recent world events. So putting all of that into action and thinking about the deeds and not just prayers and warm wishes. So
Yeah, I think a lot of people get very frustrated when, there's a school shooting, or I mean, we had the shooting just recently in Maine, and then there's a lot of thoughts and prayers, which, I understand the thoughts and prayers approach. A lot of times when people feel helpless, if you live in, California and there's something happening in Maine, and a lot of times people feel like, well, what can I do? And sometimes the only thing that they can feel like they can do is to reach out to their relationship with the divine, right? So if I pray, or if I offer my energy, my feelings, it's something I can do, right? And so I think it's a fairly natural response to try to be comforting. At the same time, like you're saying, it can feel very empty if it's not followed with some level of actual action that can help. And even no matter where you are, you can always donate monies. You can donate time to organizations locally that then, have a ripple effect more nationally or even internationally. So I think that there is a call for something more than just, oh, I checked off the box of thoughts and prayers and now I don't have to think about it anymore. And
right.
you
And
know,
I have no idea. I'm having an attribution error right now, so I can't give the source for this. But I just, the phrase that stuck with me right there was think globally, act locally. And I'm sure some organization out there coined that, or somebody, and I wish I could give them credit, but I'm having an attribution error right now. But it really fits. It's like, even though you can think globally as far as compassion with thoughts and prayers and all of that for the suffering that's occurring anywhere, but turn that around to local action, even if that starts within your own family.
yeah, I love that. So Elder Arden finishes his talk and he quotes three different scriptures from three different works of scripture: the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Bible. He says, may we be forever looking to the well-being of others and show in word and deed, which is kind of what we're talking about, that we are, quote, willing to bear one another's burdens, which for those of us who have been baptized into the church, that's part of our baptismal covenants, to bind up the brokenhearted, and to keep Christ's second great commandment to love thy neighbor. So that's, I can totally get behind that kind of a message.
It's lovely.
It
Yeah.
is. It is lovely. And I think it's inspiring. And to hear church leaders talk in that kind of a language, I think can be very, helpful if if church membership matters to you, to hear these kinds of messages, whether it's from religious leaders or political leaders or any type of leader. I think compassion and charity are great messages. Another message that I think went well is the talk by Elder Robert M. Daines. And his talk was titled, Sir, We Would Like to See Jesus. And I thought this was kind of interesting because he, out of all the things, because we're going to talk about some of the negative things too. So it's just so contradictory. This is what kind of drives me nutty. But what he's talking about, which I think is so interesting, is that sometimes we think we're being loving by following rules and kind of by following, you know, certain aspects of things like of the gospel. But then he kind of calls this being spiritually face blind, that he says that I saw rules but not the face of the Father's mercy, right? And so he talks about, when we're acting, are we acting in a way that people can actually feel the love that we're trying to represent? If we're considering ourselves representatives of Jesus Christ or of Heavenly Father or of God, or all the language that people might use for divine beings, are people feeling that kind of love that we're trying to personify? And he gives some examples of when Jesus walked the earth and what it was like to be in his presence and what people said about that. But are our meetings, are our lessons, even, are our ways of managing other people, are they going to feel the love of God? So I think that's a beautiful message, and it kind of, I think, focuses on spirit of the law versus letter of the law, which is kind of some language that we hear in a lot of religious circles. Like, are we going to focus more on the rules and the standards, or are we going to focus more on the relationships, feelings, and what the principles are really meant to be about? Which, if you read the New Testament, that's pretty much Jesus Christ's freaking message all the time, right? It's like all these people are asking him, well, why aren't you following these rules? And he's like, I think you're missing the point of the rule. Like, I think of a classic one, like, why did you heal somebody on the Sabbath? That's not, you're not honoring the Sabbath, you're working on the Sabbath. And he's like, I'm offering healing and compassion on the Sabbath, right? Like, I think you're missing the point of the Sabbath. So this is kind of a cool talk. And I don't know if you have any thoughts from what I've said from this.
Well, I think it just ties back into, compassionate deeds, is kind of the point of it all. I mean, people should be, even if they're somebody that is considered a sinner or has somehow sinned and broken the rules, that reaching out with compassion, because they're already going to feel very othered, and reaching out with compassion rather than judgment and condemnation, or just strictly following the rules because that's what the rules say. Again, that ties back into the whole idea of being face blind. You aren't really seeing the person for a person. And, that the whole idea behind any Christian works are to bring healing, ease suffering. Sure, I mean, you can always say we need to be as compliant as we can humanly be with scripture or doctrine, but I don't think Jesus would agree that, I mean, just by your own example about why are you working on the Sabbath? It's like, well, because this is the compassionate thing to do. These are the good works. And when the rules stop good works, you kind of have to stop and think about the rule. What function is that rule serving?
Mm. Right. Right. Exactly. So those were some great talks. And just with what you just said, what rule is that? Is what purpose is that rule serving? Then we get to probably one of the more controversial talks in the conference address, and probably the one that we have seen the most come up in our practice, is President Nelson's talk, which was called Think Celestial. And this was very rule centric. It was a very rule centric talk. So for those who don't understand some of the concepts of the doctrine of the Mormon Church, of the LDS Church, basically we don't really have a binary of heaven and hell in our doctrine. It's not like you either go to heaven or you go to hell. We have these ideas of like kingdoms, that there are different levels of kind of status or of kingdoms that you can reach in the afterlife. And the celestial kingdom is like the best one, and there's a lot of benefits to getting to the celestial kingdom. Like that's where you can continue your relationships with family members that you have here on earth. So if you're married in the LDS temple, then that's something that will still be in place in the afterlife if you make it to the celestial kingdom. There's two other kingdoms, the terrestrial and the telestial kingdom. And so there's like these layers. And there is outer darkness, which is, I guess, Mormon hell. I think that's the worst thing that can happen. But you have to be pretty, you pretty much have to know without a shadow of a doubt that you're rejecting God and Jesus Christ to kind of get to that level of kind of being outcasted. So these three levels, even though they're all considered, like fairly okay levels to get to, the celestial one is like the one that everybody is trying to get to. And it's not seen as okay to only want to get to the telestial kingdom or the terrestrial kingdom. Everybody should want to get to the celestial kingdom. So one of the issues that we see in kind of Mormon / LDS culture that this unfortunately breeds is perfectionism. There's a certain level of perfectionism that happens because you can't just make it to any level. You have to make it to the top level. And, one of the things that he says here that he quotes is that all covenants, contracts, bonds, obligations, oaths, vows, performances, connections, associations, or expectations that are not made and entered into and sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise have an end when men are dead, right? So this is kind of a big part of Mormon doctrine, is that if you don't do your part in honoring these covenants and keeping these standards, you're just not going to make it. You're not going to make it. Okay, so let's think about that. Let's think about the implications of this, because if the standards of the Church of Jesus Christ were, hey, be a nice freaking person, be nice to others, be charitable, right? Don't bully, don't be a rude person, right? Don't hurt other people on purpose. Don't steal or kill or take away from other people in ways that are really damaging. Don't rape people, don't be, a sex trafficker. If those were the standards we were talking about, okay, like let's have a pretty good social, kind of idea of what being a good person in a society might look like. And if you follow those basic standards, then maybe you can, get to the celestial kingdom. But this is not typically what the leaders of the church are talking about. What they're talking about is things like, don't be gay, don't masturbate, don't have relationships that are sexual, outside of marriage. And of course, marriage only between a man and a woman. Don't, Yeah, pay your tithing. Don't leave the church. Don't leave our church. Only be a member of our church. So now you get huge swaths of people that are, either family members of church members or who are still in the church themselves, who just by being pretty much a human being and even certain orientations, like don't be transgender, even don't be asexual, because you need to procreate, right? You need to be married and procreate. Now you're really kind of hitting up against basic human diversity, basic human identity that disqualifies you because you're quote unquote not following the covenants and the standards as these church leaders understand them, of being a good person that you can spend the eternities in the celestial kingdom with your family and with your covenants intact. So in a time where we're having more faith transitions than ever, we're having more mixed faith families than ever in our church, we're having more people feel comfortable coming out and being authentically who they are in the LGBTQIA plus community. This is so damaging. So damaging to have this type of talk that is about the letter of the law, and that law being very being interpreted in a way that's very discriminatory versus the spirit of the law.
Well,
Love
there's so much to
I love
say.
your response.
Where to start? There's, I just go back to, if you just look at who Jesus reached out to and hung out with and traveled with, I I don't think a lot of Jesus's people back in the day when Jesus walked the earth, I don't think a lot of them would qualify. So what does that say?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so easy to other and to rule out, when the real challenge that faces Christians is the compassion of reaching out and bringing in. I mean, this feels like a shepherd that keeps trying to downsize his flock. And I'm like, is that really the point? I thought the point was to increase. And this feels very much like a narrowing. It just feels contradictory to me in a very real world way, and in a very philosophical way, and in a very theological way. So I'm not sure what to do with that, because it doesn't make Christian sense to me. And so
Yeah, and for those of you who are listening and don't know, Alan is one of the few providers at Symmetry Solutions who is what we lovingly call him a no-mo, right? Or a never-mo. So he does not come from a Latter-day Saint background. He does come from his own kind of religious background. I don't know if you want to share a little bit of that, but I think even in your religious community, you saw some of this kind of othering.
oh sure, yeah. Well, that's the thing about all religions, is all religions have a set of standards and practices. And so by strict definition, there is no religion that does not other people. There's always others. They're not like us. They don't fit in. They don't meet our standards. They don't believe what we believe. Even among Christians other each other all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an inherent contradiction and kind of infighting. And you mentioned earlier that whole in-group, out-group dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And but when you get down to the essential Christian messages, those ones that Jesus said, I mean, got a little book over there on my bookshelf that was just what Jesus said. It's strictly a collection of what Jesus said. And if you read through that, you're like, wow, this is not hard.
Yeah.
It's actually easy to walk this walk and talk this talk. But there's also all kinds of things in there that churches and religious people do all the time that aren't in accordance with that. So who you going to believe, who you going to follow, who are you going to listen to? And I think Jesus would have said believe, but also listen to the compassion and humanity of your own heart. I mean, he did when he worked on the Sabbath. I mean, but this othering, I mean, that's often when people ask me what I do as a therapist. I say I work with people who are undergoing faith transitions or crises, existential crises and things like that. And I said, like I described previously, I said, all religions have others that don't fit in. And I said, that's who I work with, is I work with the others to try and bring them some solace, a sense of belonging, a sense of wholeness, a sense that they even have the right to exist sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and that's so interesting that you talked about, who are you going to believe? Because this is another really, I think pain point for so many people who listened, who are in mixed faith families. I work with the Mounts on, they run a mixed faith podcast called Marriage on a Tightrope. Highly recommend. They run a Facebook group for folks who are in those positions that is, really does a great job of taking both sides into account, right? Like, what is it like to be the believer in that type of relationship? What is it like to be the non-believer? How are they going to parent? How are they going to stay married? I think their little catchphrases, and we're still married, so that's how they, and so,
somehow this craziness is still working.
Right. Like, we can still love each other in spite of differing beliefs. Imagine that, and so it's really lovely work. It's some of the most favorite work I get to do, is working with mixed faith couples and really getting to honor both of their perspectives and helping them learn how to honor each other's perspectives. And so you can imagine, I was in the middle of offering one of these classes when the conference was taking place. And then the following, so a lot of non-believers are walking the walk by supporting their believing spouses, in the church. So many of the people that were in this class were actually watching General Conference with their believing spouse or with their believing children, just being of support and trying to be, loving in that way. And then this is what they get to hear, right? So President Nelson continues saying, there's no end to the adversary's deception. So now we're talking about Satan being, deceiving people. And so he says, please be prepared. Never take counsel from those who do not believe. Never take counsel from those who do not believe. So if somebody has a different belief system than you can't take counsel from them. And then he says, seek guidance from voices you can trust. So meaning those who do not believe, you cannot trust. That's the implication, right? And so he says, from prophets and seers and revelators and from the whisperings of the Holy Ghost. Okay, well, you can imagine. I hope you can imagine. I'm encouraging you to imagine what that might be like for a mixed faith couple to hear that counsel from the main leader of their church community. What it might be like to be a parent who has gone through a faith transition, but you're still supporting your own children going to church, who's going to listen to this leader who basically now has said, do not take counsel from anyone who does not believe, who is now your parent. And this is undermining parents. What kind of effect might that have on a couple who is counseling with each other, who should counsel more than anything with each other? about how they're going to live their lives and what dreams they have and what values they're going to instill in their home and with their children. And now this is the big idea that they get from their main leader. Now, granted, there are many people, and there were many believers in the group who said, yeah, I don't agree with my own prophet on this. Of course I'm going to counsel with my partner and my love and my, the person that I've attached myself to. But there were also believers that were like, well, this is hard for me because this is my leader. This is my prophet. This, I do trust him to give me guidance, right? So I guess what really angers me, and this goes back to the talk that I just mentioned. I forget which one it was, but in the one where he said, that we should, are we giving our lessons and our meetings in a way that people can feel God's love, right? And I think oftentimes President Nelson is speaking to people who are already keeping the standards, so they may feel loved, the standards according to him. But all the other people that don't fall under that are not going to feel, the love of God or of Jesus or of any divinity with these kinds of things. And then what the other leader said, well, the reason I struggle with having, focusing on rules and not focusing on the love, that's not the church's fault. That's not God's fault. That's my fault. And I'm like, I'm going to call a little BS on that. I think it is the church's fault. I think when people like President Nelson say, follow the standards, don't trust other people, don't counsel with other people, only people that think like us and believe like us and follow the standards, like I have said, those are the only people you can ever feel comfortable with. That has a huge impact. There's a power differential there that impacts people and systems. And President Nelson is using his power as the main patriarch of this community and influencing. He has huge influence. You have to know when you have influence, right? We as therapists are constantly trying to check our influence, right? Because we're in an expert position and people might come in and feel like they have to follow our advice. We're not supposed to be giving advice. We're supposed to be helping people come up with their own ideas, right? Because we need to catch our influence all the time. It's like ethics 101 for us. So no, I do place blame on the church as far as why people struggle in these particular ways.
Sure. Because again, it seems like the more you double down, the more you narrow your focus, the more people you marginalize, the more people you other, the more people you alienate, the more people you put in a position of doubt, of moral quandary. And we see this play out for us with the people that come through our physical or virtual door all the time, seeking relief from the extreme shame or the outcast feeling, the confusion, the sense of not belonging, the sense of loss of community. And that has such a real world impact on individuals, couples, families, communities. And, I feel like a lot of times I'm just kind of left to try and clean up after a lot of these more rigid statements that tend to further alienate people that really just want somebody to welcome them in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, first of all, that's an experience that I just need I'll say this every general conference, but I need people to understand that the Utah hotline for suicide usually reports much more increased calls after, during a general conference weekend. I also have talked to hundreds of therapists in the state of Utah that would corroborate what you just said, and we see it constantly in our office, that the following weeks after General Conference is usually an upsurge of people calling in and starting therapy services, and those who are in therapy already with us are bringing these kinds of topics to the table. We might not even be working on anything that has to do with these issues, but all of a
Mhm.
sudden now we are, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so I think now, and now it seems to be like the catchphrase, think celestial. So think about that. For a Latter-day Saint person, that might seem like a really wonderful reminder, like, oh, think celestial. That just helps me, continue on my path and make good choices for my life.
Mhm.
But as soon as you're saying that or having a flag up or, putting that as a motto in your home, every single time somebody sees that who is on the margins, and whether you realize it or not, you have people in your life who are in the margins, whether it's your own children, whether it's your friends, whether it's extended family, they come into your home and they see that motto or whatever, they now realize there's something about this space where I'm not safe. I can't be my authentic person in this particular space, because if I'm gay, if I'm, if maybe even if I'm in agreement that I should be shifting some of my behaviors, right? Like maybe if I'm like, yeah, maybe I am struggling with having certain behaviors in my life aligned, it's still a space of shame, because it's a reminder that, oh yeah, I'm not there yet. And you have to remember that, especially in a perfectionistic society like ours, that can be really small things that people are feeling shame about. And also things that people in the mainstream, kind of milieu are not feeling shame about. Even something as simple as masturbating, which we know is normative behavior.
Babies do it in the womb. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
I come back to
you
this
can't explain
example.
that away. Babies do it in the womb.
Yeah. I come back to this example of, like, if you're an Orthodox Jewish person, you might feel a lot of shame about eating pork. The rest of us are not feeling shame about that.
Uh-uh.
If you're a Muslim woman, you might feel shame for not wearing a hijab. Most of us don't feel shame about showing our hair. It's not something we even think about. It's not something that takes up energy in our lives. So what Latter-day Saints need to come to terms with is, what are we holding ourselves as to a standard to that most people in the world are not putting a lot of energy to,
Mhm.
but we are. And it's okay to have your stance. It's okay for the Muslims to have the belief in the hijab. It's okay for the Orthodox Jews to have the belief about kosher eating. But when you start looking at that as, this is now Satan and this is now something I'm doing that's like against humankind or against my own personal salvation, it's like, no, it's a standard. It's a religious standard that
Mhm.
happens to be different than many other religious standards. And if you want to comply with this religious standard as part of your worship because it helps you remind yourself that this is part of your community, that's one thing. But if you're now seeing yourself as an addict or, a less of a human or unworthy, which is the language we use in LDS circles, that starts really having mental health ramifications that are not healthy.
You That word unworthy reminds me of Brene Brown, the way she talks about shame. And Brene Brown is a great researcher. I really appreciate her as a researcher because she has a very uncommon knack among most intellectuals and academics, and that she's able to take her research and then put it in very relatable language that people can consume. She's not just preaching to the choir, she's talking to the masses, and she's very good at that. So I really appreciate her as a researcher. But she's done a lot of research around shame, and it contains the word unworthy in there, because the definition of shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love. And I can't think of anything more unchristian than making somebody feel unworthy of love.
And it's bad enough when it's people love. It's really, I think, pernicious when you're projecting something as mysterious and really, quite frankly, something I don't think, if it exists, that we can even understand, would be something like God's love,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So that to project, for President Nelson as a white elderly man, in a particular culture, to think that he has the understanding of something so complex and universal and broad is very, first of all, I think very interesting that we can have that much confidence in something that we know very little about.
Mhm.
And second of all, just again, that influence of how many people are going to feel not like the other talk that said, are we projecting the love of God, but really the conditions of God's love, which are then, if you don't meet those conditions, you don't get it. You don't get this reward. You don't get to be with your family. You don't get to have relationships. You don't even get to have a certain type of body according to Mormon doctrine, right? That in the hereafter. He also talks about, I'll just talk about this briefly because I know we have a whole nother topic we want to discuss, but he says, when you are confronted with a dilemma, think celestial. And I remember, many times throughout my time as a member of the church that having a forward thinking attitude was helpful to me. That if I had a problem right here, right now, thinking, well, this will pass, or there's a future, or there's an afterlife, or, whatever beliefs I had were helpful to me. It was like, I don't have to, be super dismayed that I'm going through this trial right in this moment. There's more to life. There's more to the hereafter. However, there's another side to that coin. there's always two sides to a coin. And so when he continues, when he says something like, when tested by temptation, think celestial. When life or loved ones let you down, think celestial. When someone dies prematurely, think celestial. When someone lingers with a devastating illness, think celestial. When the pressures of life crowd in upon you, think celestial. Are you, as you recover from an accident or injury, as I am doing now, because he just had a hip issue or something, I think he fell, think celestial. So there's a little bit of a minimizing here of what it's like to go through a very significant problem. And I, even when he says, illnesses and death, and I think of mental health diagnoses like depression. I think sometimes, and we're not the only religion that does this. A lot of religions are kind of like, just be happy, it'll be fine, you'll get to heaven, the Lord will take care of it. It's they can be very minimizing messages for somebody who is dealing with something especially as chronic and difficult as chronic depression. Sometimes it doesn't allow people to grieve the death of a person. It's like, well, think celestial, instead of like, no, this is a time to rage and to rant and to, to bawl, right? And to just be in the depths of grief and feeling. So I think sometimes in these kinds of communities, we go too quickly to just get over it.
Mhm.
It'll be fine.
Mhm. Well, we tend to be very emotionally dismissive, especially around very strong feelings. It's very uncomfortable for most people to hold space with intense emotions. And we know this as therapists because it's part of our training is to be able to sit there and hold space with these intense emotions that people can experience and display for us and process and go through for themselves. And that's a very difficult space to be in sometimes because, our natural tendency is, oh, well, guy, I need to do something to make it stop, to make it go away. But what really needs is we need to let people actually process this. This is one of those things that's better out than in. Emotional suppression doesn't help. Suppression of anything doesn't help. When you suppress something, it's still going to be expressed, but probably not in a healthy way.
Right.
So allowing that to happen instead of minimizing, just welcoming it. It's like, yeah, get it out, feel it, but I acknowledge it's really difficult for people. There's something about our society Western society. There's Eastern societies that handle emotional expression around grief, and even Middle Eastern cultures, and even some Eastern European cultures and things like that, that you're completely allowed to wail and rant and just get it out. But for some reason, we're really buttoned down around that here in the US. So it took me a long time to, even for myself, because I'm a product of this culture. So it took me a long time for myself to allow myself to have big feels around things. And yeah, the minimizing is concerning. And it really just tells me that that's because we're uncomfortable with those feelings and we don't really know what to do with them when people have them.
Yeah, yeah. I totally agree with that. So that's our little recap on General Conference. There were other messages too that, I mean, we could probably talk for as long as General Conference went on about all the different messages. But so anyway, we hope to just kind of give some mental health kind of perspectives on some of these messages and why they might be either helpful or damaging, and then just noticing and pointing out that there are contradictions in what you hear, even in one General Conference, right? So you'll hear a message over here that says this, and then you'll hear this other message that's, saying something pretty different. And so I think that that's good for people to recognize that and to sit with that discomfort, and to invite some level of cognitive dissonance into your thought process so that you can become a good critical thinker about how these messages may affect your life or the life of those that you love, whether you're in or out of the church community or somewhere in between. So the next topic that we want to talk about is kind of this ongoing thing that we've been addressing for a while. It's all over all the podcasts, it's all over the news here in Utah anyway, but over the last few months, like there have been like several, like I can think of 4 or 5 at least, therapists and that have been called into question for some really interesting, unethical, harmful practices that were members of the church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because we want to be clear which church we're talking about, that were also usually referred to by leaders in the church. So kind of on somehow on the list of the church that, you have providers that are seen as safe and helpful to LDS folks, and also that were licensed in the state. They had not lost their license for any particular reason and until something pretty freaking dramatic started happening, right? And so, I just off the top of my head, we've got Jody Hildebrandt, that was arrested for child abuse and, led huge programs within the church community in regards to porn addiction, sex addiction, parenting plans. It sounds like she had an impact on even the Latter-day Saint addiction program, so just very, very involved in treatment approaches that are not clinically based, as far as they're not clinically based, but they're supported by the church. Maurice Harker was another one. He ran the Sons of Helaman program that has been extremely popular in the church community, again, against masturbation and pornography. Now is facing, counts of abuse of clients, both physical and sexual abuse. We've got Tom Harrison, which I haven't totally dived into this one yet, but just a lot of, very interesting dilemmas of how again, influence and, kind of extranatural influence about ideas and, revelations for people, definitely mixing religion and his profession in ways that were very inappropriate, and again, had a lot of influence on people, even tied to like the Daybells in Idaho and that whole story. So just really, really messy, horrible stuff. So then I'm perusing Facebook one day, and I see the advertising for AMCAP, and AMCAP is the Association for Mormon Counselors and Professionals. I think that's their name. Which now actually they have changed to Latter-day Saint, even though the M is still there for AMCAP, so they're not totally rebranding. You know, we've got that whole LDS Mormon issue going on right now as far as our language.
Well, it would make for a messy acronym, so.
Yeah, ALCAP, I don't know. So that's, they haven't changed that. But so I see that they just had their annual conference, and in September, end of September, so last month, and guess who their keynote speaker was? So was it a leading researcher in the field? Was it a leading clinician? Was it, you know, clinicians here, even in the state of Utah, who are LDS? Nope. It was Elder Tad R. Callister, which the first time Tad R. Callister came into my purview of understanding who he was, it was because he gave a talk, I don't know, over a decade ago at BYU, Idaho, where he really gave a very shaming talk on masturbation to these, you know, emerging adults who are mostly single, and also pornography, and just very, you know, just a lot of provocative language is what I would consider, like the tentacles of the octopus are going to come and get you, of Satan. I mean, I was just like, wow, like this is really over the top. And I even wrote a letter into the church's offices at the time, and shared my concerns as an LDS therapist of giving a talk like that. And, you know, next thing I heard, he was promoted to, you know, to another level of hierarchy in the church. I was like, well, I guess my letter was not very important. Anyway, so just to help you all understand what AMCAP is, so, and this is right out of their website, okay? And I remember looking to join this organization years ago when I was a, you know, baby therapist, and wondering if I could join with other like-minded professionals. I lived in Kansas at the time, so I knew that there was the Association for Christian Counselors that a lot of my cohorts belonged to. And so I thought, I wonder if there's something like that for LDS folks. And sure enough, I find AMCAP, and this is what was on their website. It was actually stronger language back then, but this is what's on their website now. So if you want to be eligible to be a member for AMCAP, it says here, only individual persons who adhere to the ideals and principles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints are eligible for consideration and acceptance as a member. And if you're going to, and your standard of conduct as a therapist needs to be so that it's in a manner that supports and is consistent with the standards and doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So here's a professional association, and the Christian Counseling Association is the same. It's just as problematic, right? But here's associations that are saying, okay, therapists, you want to belong to our association? You better conduct therapy in a way that the church is going to see as correct. No talk here in this whole thing, because there's several things, about them providing therapy in a way that is aligned with professional code of ethics. That's not included here. So I'm like, okay, and this is, by the way, a lot of what I presented at the UAMFT, which is the Association for Marriage and Family Therapists. I was the keynote speaker for that back in May. So I presented this information. I said, okay, so let's consider this. Let's say that you're a member of AMCAP, which I know many people are, you know, here in the state of Utah. So let's go look at what the church's positions are. If you're going to conduct therapy in a way that is in adherence with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, let's see what that looks like. And so this is taken directly from the church's website around, let's just pick one topic, sexual orientation. So it's, the doctrine of the church is related to marriage between a man and a woman, is well known and will remain unchanged. We may not know precisely why some people feel attracted to others of the same sex, which we already know that anytime you're talking about same-sex attraction, That's a red flag for religions not wanting to basically admit that even sexual orientation exists and that identity may. Then they say the Savior Jesus Christ has a perfect understanding of every challenge we experience. So now they're saying, same-sex attraction is a challenge. Again, not an identity. And then they say, under basic teachings of chastity, homosexual activity is a serious sin. It is contrary to the purposes of human sexuality. It distorts loving, well, and that assumes that human sexuality is only about procreation. And many heterosexual couples can't procreate anyway, but let's just ignore those points for a minute.
Or have sex for other than non-procreational purposes.
Right? It distorts loving relationships and prevents people from receiving the blessings that can be found in family life and the saving ordinances of the gospel.
Gay people have families.
So can we offer therapy that supports and is consistent with the standards and doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints while still following our, both of us are MFT, so let's go look at AMFT Code of Ethics, which says marriage and family therapists provide professional assistance to persons without discrimination on many things. I mean, there's like 50 things listed here: race, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. I'll skip through a lot of these things, but it says sexual orientation, gender identity, or relationship status. So how can you be a therapist who belongs to AMCAP, and also be providing therapy that is aligned with AMFT Code of Ethics?
There's an inherent contradiction there.
And this, and the reason, and this is so interesting because, one of the things too that the AMFT Code of Ethics says is that we cannot discriminate against religion, basis of religion. What I think a lot of therapists have misunderstood about becoming a therapist is that they think that their religion should not be discriminated against as a therapist versus them not discriminating against other people's religion, values, or beliefs. So if you're conducting therapy from your religious lens, that is unethical. And this is running rampant in this state, rampant. Anytime you see a website that says sex addiction, porn addiction, we'll help you stop masturbating. Well, if you see anything around helping you remain in your faith, things like, if you come into my practice and you have issues around masturbation because of your religious beliefs, I do have to honor that as a therapist. I can't just be like, well, you shouldn't think that way. I can definitely offer you some psychoeducation. I can offer you some ideas. But I need to value your beliefs as whatever religion you come into, seeing me that. But if I, as a therapist, am like, yeah, come to me because I want to help all people stop masturbating, that's not the American Pediatric Association's position. That's not AMFT's position. That's not sexological health positions. That is a Mormon position. And now I'm just assuming that all people should not masturbate because that's what I religiously believe. And that is what is happening and what is driving me batty for the last 20 years of my professional life.
Yeah. Well, in the clients I have right now, I have clients from both ends of the spectrum. I have clients that have felt such deep shame around their own human sexuality that we're working through that. And then I've got other clients that are like, yeah, I really feel like my behavior is out of compliance with my internalized values around my religion. And I really would like to get better control around that. And whichever direction you're coming at me from, I'm here to honor your goals, not mine. But when you're standing there saying, come to me, I will help all of you stop masturbating, that's your goals. That's not their goals.
Yes.
You've turned the pyramid on its head. You've got it standing on its point.
Yes.
You've
Right.
turned things upside down.
Another thing I just want to point out on the church's website on sexual orientation, which again, if we're going to, as therapists, be aligning ourselves with church doctrine while we're treating LGBTQ folks, they actually put on that website front page on sexual orientation Leviticus 20:13 from the Old Testament, which we already know from a critical theological perspective that there are many problems with this scripture and how it was interpreted and how it was, retranslated 500,000 times. But it says if a man,
And the Levitical codes are cherry picked. It's like if you want to follow one, you need to follow all of
all of
them.
them,
And all of you wearing polyester or anything out there are equally guilty. I mean, come on.
and
You
eating
just can't you
shrimp and
just can't
wearing
cherry pick.
jewelry. Hmm.
You
Yeah,
just
I
can't
mean,
cherry pick.
right now, I guess I should be put to death because I'm wearing this little necklace. But it says here, if a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. So when we have shootings, like in Colorado that are at a gay club that happen to be a former or even current member of the church, and the church just wants to say, well, that's not the church. That's just a person who acted, and anybody from any church could act this way, and that's true. But again, the church isn't taking responsibility for the fact that these things are taught within the church system. That violence is actually taught as a means of dealing with people who we other, like the LGBTQ community. So for them to have that front and page and center, I mean, they could have just stopped at it's an abomination. Even that's pretty crappy language, but they included that part about being put to death. It's just so incredibly mind-boggling to me how in 2023 we are justifying deep discrimination. I mean, I feel like I should have started this with a trigger warning, because this is like deep discrimination for LGBTQ folks. And then to just be like, oh, sorry, that I guess it's just God's fault, and face no personal accountability for how we're teaching these things is just mind-blowing to me. Along on this lines, I mean, the LDS Church's position on gender, right? So church leaders counsel against elective medical or surgical intervention for the purpose of attempting to transition to the opposite gender of a person's birth sex. Leaders advise that taking these actions will be cause for church membership restrictions. Leaders also counsel against social transitioning. A social transition includes changing dress or grooming or changing a name or pronouns to present oneself as other than his or her birth sex. So if you're a therapist, first of all, there's this thing called WPATH guidelines, right? Clinical guidelines of how we are to work with folks, that are on the gender spectrum. And, just to just read one thing from the WPATH website, it says what WPATH recognizes that health is dependent upon not only good clinical care, but also social and political climates that provide and ensure social tolerance, equality, and the full rights of citizenship. Health is promoted through public policies and legal reforms that promote tolerance and equity for gender and sexual diversity, and that eliminate prejudice, discrimination, and stigma. So how can you be a trans-affirming clinician and belong to AMCAP? And if you say, well, I won't see trans people, you can't do that as a therapist. You can't, because that goes back to the code of ethics. You can't discriminate, against people because of their gender identity. It's right there. It's one of the basic things. So maybe therapy is not the profession you should be in. Maybe that's the question you should be thinking. Maybe there are other professions you could do well in instead of coming into this
Pastoral
profession.
counseling or
But
you
even
know
pastoral counseling has ethics
they
that have to
do
do with not
they do
discriminating.
yeah, they do.
Yeah. Most people who are going through pastoral counseling, most, not all, but many of them belong to churches that are not on the conservative spectrum, that are more on the affirming spectrums of LGBTQ issues and things of that nature. So if we're wondering why Jody Hildebrands exist,
I was
why?
actually meaning pastoral counseling more like as a pastor.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that
right.
type. I didn't mean to take counselors and lump them in there. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, so why do these people exist? Why do we have so many therapists? Why do we have so many confused public people about what denotes? I mean, it's so frustrating to me when I have like a wife who is in the throes of feeling betrayed by a pornography viewing of her husband, which I totally empathize with. I totally understand that. I have felt that myself many times in my own life. And she's seeing the only option for treatment is pornography addiction treatment, which we know is ineffective and is not going to help her have a better relationship, better ongoing trust with her husband, better sex with her husband, better anything. And then she's upset with me, because I'm trying to offer some of these basic psychoeducations about what is good clinical care. But I've got this entire culture here that basically is saying, no, Natasha, you're wrong. We should be treating people with religious bias and religious ideas of what the best standards of care are, that are not supported by any research, any data. And you desperately want to help people. You desperately want to help them have, repair those relationships, find healthy ways to be sexual, find honest ways to be sexual with each other, not have that secrecy, not have that shame for either one of them. And it's almost impossible to climb that hill.
Yeah, it's you're really kind of painting yourself into a corner, um, kind of ethically when you align yourself with doctrine over evidence-based practices, um, with belief and faith and religion has a place in our lives, and it can be such a wonderful source of inspiration and aspiration. And that's something that I work with couples or individuals who've had a faith transition away from whatever religion they're transitioning away from, is they kind of have that existential crisis because they've lost that kind of that whole framework of what was my life aspiring towards and what was the big end goal and all of that, kind of that think celestial. I mean, it's like think celestial serves a great purpose in one way, in that it can keep you future focused, which psychologically can be very helpful. But you also don't want it to be the only thing. You also need to deal with the here and now in people's lives sometimes. And that's kind of what that kind of misses. It kind of skips that beat. And it when you talk about that minimizing. And so I'm often working with people, it's like, well, so what are you aspiring towards now? What is that big future goal? What is that big endpoint? But that's all part of treatment planning. That's all part of psychoeducation. It's all part of human nature. But we all know that the way that you get there is you just can't leapfrog there. There's a whole bunch of steps in between. So let's start here. And how do you get to the next step and the next step and the next step? And then how do you just keep putting one foot in front of the other until you reach that goal? So
Yeah.
it can be so healthy and so healing. But then when you get the people who are othered by it, and they lose that framework, or they need to reject it because it's self-protective, because it doesn't constantly reinforce that internalized shame of I'm unworthy of love. People can only do a diet of that for so long before that just becomes self-destructive. And that's why we see that uptick in suicidality and self-harm, alcohol and drug use. They're trying to numb. They just need to feel different. They're trying to cope the best way they can under a system that's got them othered by them, othered by the system, othered by the participants. And when you're young enough, it even internalizes, and now you other yourself. And so when they finally get the courage to step away from that and go, I can't take this pain anymore. I can't other myself anymore. I can't be the other. I need to belong somewhere. I need to be worthy of love somewhere, someplace, to somebody in this world. So I guess my point is, religion's not always your friend.
Mm-hmm.
It can be.
Mm-hmm.
But what about when it isn't?
And it can be both.
And how do we reach out with compassion and those good deeds to those people? How do we treat them?
Right.
I mean, one of the measures of the quality of civilization, of a civilized society, is how it treats the least amongst them. And to me, that sounds like a very Christ-like message. How are we treating the least amongst us?
Yeah, and this, I mean, I think where my heart goes out the most is for parents who have minors. And, I think most parents are so protective of their minors, and especially if they're coming from these religious frameworks. They find out that their kid is gay, or they find out that their kid is watching pornography or is masturbating, and the anxiety of that as a parent, especially coming from these religious systems, can be so high. And that is a primary time to be vulnerable for unethical therapists who are imposing their religious bias on your kid and on you. And you feel safe because you feel like, okay, this is somebody who has my same beliefs. But in reality, that's faux safety, because you're taking your child to a clinician who is going to not do best standards of care, who's just going to impose a religious mindset on that kid that, at 15, at 16, at 12, at 19, they're in such a developmentally tender time where shame, we know that, again, through the research of, I think, Brene Brown and others who have done so much work on shame, is that we feel the most shame during our teenage years and also our elderly years. It's kind of interesting. That's when we're most prone to shame. And so if you're sticking your kid, even though you're doing your best as a parent, right, because you think this is going to be what's most helpful, into a system where now they're going to be shamed about very natural aspects of their sexuality or their identity or their whatever it is, you're really arresting that development that is supposed to be happening during those years, which will have impacts for decades to come. Decades to come. And these are all the people that we see in adult life. All the adults we're seeing are people who were arrested developmentally usually in their sexuality and their gender identities and even in their critical thinking skills, because the only answer was to conform. And the therapist that they went to, or that their parents sent them to, were complicit in that system, instead of bringing, the ability to be non-biased and to put your own beliefs aside, which is hard for all of us as therapists, granted, but we're supposed to be doing that personal work to put our especially religious biases aside so we can do good clinical work. And that is not happening at such an alarming rate in this state. Is it any wonder that we have these news stories in the news today? So please, please be careful. Please do your homework. Please understand that even if it feels comfortable to you to have somebody from a similar background or belief system, that may not be what's best from a mental health perspective. Church is church, mental health is mental health. They're two different things. A bishop shouldn't act like a therapist, and a therapist should not act like a bishop. I've been saying that for 25 plus years, right? So
absolutely.
Thank you, Allan, for joining me today.
Thanks, Natasha, for having me.
It was a lot. So if any of you are listening, please check us out at symmetrypath.com if you're needing services for mental health, if you're needing coaching, therapy, or resources, right? Or referrals. Sometimes we're not the best fit, but sometimes, most of the time, we have a good idea of where we can send you to. So we'll give you those best thinkings, and hope you continue to follow the podcast, and we'll see you all next time. Take care.
Take care, everybody.
thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional Facebook page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the now, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki shade the novel, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.